Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Gentlemen First Cinephiles. It is Alfred August, and we are here to talk about The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Also his wife, who probably knew too much as well, but due to compartmentalization didn't know quite as much as the man. And that's a whole plot point.
And that's a whole plot point. The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's a very interesting film for Hitchcock. I'm joined by Evelyn once more. Evelyn,
How's it going?
I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about, the very first Man Who Knew Too Much, and then we'll get into the remake, because the remake is really where all the meat and potatoes are. But to describe the plot of both films. So Man Who Knew Too Much, it was originally made in the 1930s with Peter Lorre, and it's around when Peter Lorre first went to Hollywood. And you can tell because you can see Hollywood really trying to capitalize off of his role in M during the duration of the filming of The Man Who Knew Too Much. But in addition to that, the film follows a couple, and at the very root of the story, it's about a couple who accidentally get involved in the situation. Somebody gets murdered. They pass along information to the woman in the cup,
The woman in the cub.
Well, I was going to say the woman in the couple, but it's only the woman in the 1930s one. So there's a couple with a child. They're out somewhere. They're usually not. They're on vacation. A assassination happens, and one of the two parents gets information from the person who was killed, and it leads to their child being kidnapped, and then hijinks ensue, and they have to get a message to an embassy before the end. So that is what both films strongly deal in. There's a lot of particulars that we'll get into, but yes, the reasons why Hitchcock thought it was a failure, I'm not certain why Hitchcock thought it was a failure, to be honest. If I'm looking at both of them, one as a remake, the other as, a fully fledged Hitchcock movie with Doris Day, Jimmy Stewart, whatever will be, will be. The very first one is very simple compared to where Hitchcock goes with The Man Who Knew Too Much in this remake of it, and you could tell that there's a lot of time in between both, where you could see where Hitchcock grew, because The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake that we'll talk about, it goes into a lot of critique of studio Hollywood and studio system control in general, etc., etc. But the original Man Who Knew Too Much, it's a very honestly compartmentalized film. It's in Sweden, and it's very simple. The woman shot puts at the beginning, she shot puts at the end to kill him. It's very open and shut. Peter, the big crux of the entire thing is playing off of Peter Lorre's role in M, honestly. Because, you have this little girl who looks a lot like Elsie Beckman in M, who's like their daughter, and then there's a bunch of shots of Peter Lorre kidnapping her or whatever, and being a big old bad guy. Which, oh my God, Peter Lorre is so cute.
How can you judge him for what he did? He has a problem. That's me trying to do an impression of Peter Lorre acting in German and then translating that to English, even though I don't remember the line that well.
It was a little Looney Tunesy. I think we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there with the impression. And then also the very first film, it's interesting how Hitchcock introduces agency into his later films, because The Man Who Knew Too Much, it's really a man's film, and I think it might even be a British film, but at its root, it's a film about a man trying to figure out, et cetera,
England,
et cetera.
did they call him Peter Truck?
Oh my God, get out of my face. Anyway, to move on past that, the woman is very non-active in the film. She's only present in really important moments or really significant elements, and I think a lot of that is because when Hitchcock brings in Doris Day in The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake, and feel free to start chiming in here, Evelyn. Yeah. He not only is subverting his own Hitchcock blonde through Doris Day, but he's in a way subverting who Doris Day's archetype was. Because when you have The Man Who Knew Too Much by Hitchcock, it was not at the height of Doris Day's popularity, because you see the things like the thrill of it all being the height of her popularity, but you kind of see this budding Doris Day who's already really developed her archetype, already subverting that the early stages, I guess, the mid stages, I suppose, of her reaching her height as an actress and a star. So when you look at The Man Who Knew Too Much originally, there's not quite that context built in, and I'm not 100% sure if that's because I'm closer to the time period that was The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake, as opposed to the 1930s one, so I may not know context, but I also, at the same time, I don't think Hitchcock is actively utilizing people for who they are to the public yet in his cinema.
Yeah. Well, also, I could imagine that considering kind of the societies that he was in when he made these films, that with the later film he felt a stronger need to emphasize the woman character too.
Yeah, that's fair. Could you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm by no means a history person, but when we look at kind of I guess gender roles in both England and the U.S. The 20s and 30s were actually pretty, like, at least in the context of the time, reasonably progressive as far as gender roles. And then World War II happened, and people kind of had this attitude of, okay, let's get back to, quote unquote, the good old days, and kind of like almost regressed a little bit.
Well, I
And
think
so,
it's
like,
interesting because I think old cinema gets this, this flack, and I think a lot of people misunderstand it in that they say that it perpetuates these ideals of women. But when you really look at what films, like, okay, let's look at figures who people say perpetuate this kind of like old age, version of a woman. Let's look at, Marilyn Monroe, Doris Day, et cetera, et cetera. When you really look at the films, they're subverting what it means to be a woman.
there's
They're
almost
not
always a play
reinforcing.
on something.
Yeah, 100%. I think The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake of it, as opposed to the 1930s ones, really plays off of gender in a lot more interesting ways than the original. Because in the original, the woman is pretty much absent for a good chunk of the film. It's just a bunch of men going at each other.
Yeah. Also, the switch of setting to moving it to, is it Morocco in the
I don't
remake?
know where specifically, but that's where I see a lot of Hitchcock's, critique of the studio system coming from. Because, the original, you have it it's in like Sweden or something, and, they stay in Sweden the whole time. And then when you move to the remake of Man Who Knew Too Much, they're pretty much like all over the place. And the interesting thing about it is that Hitchcock deliberately chose to do half the film on location and the other half of the film in studio system. So you have this really interesting function of the narrative where in the background of the film, you're seeing, at certain parts, you're seeing actual native people playing, these roles of the people in the space, in the location, Morocco or wherever it is. But then on the other hand, you have other sequences where it's just people in blackface, which I think is an interesting commentary on studio system, and I'm not quite 100% sure what it says, but it creates this whole mise en beam kind of functionality between, the studio system, and it creates this almost meta commentary with the studio system in the background of the film.
Yeah, it definitely creates a mise en beans.
How fucking dare you? Evelyn's never coming on the podcast again. Just kidding. Do you want to say something in response?
I think it definitely. Yeah, again, I don't exactly know what he's saying with that, but knowing Hitchcock, he's definitely doing something because he's far too meticulous to just do that because.
Yeah, 100%, and even like making that decision apart from the original, because the original is just one location, like pretty much one space, I believe, from what I remember.
Were the like vaguely corrupt authorities a plot point in the original, or was that something added in the remake?
I couldn't quite. It's funny because the original is so simple that you almost can't quite tell if they're authority figures or if they're just random people, But corrupt authority figures is definitely something that the next one goes into. Because, I mean, with the original Man Who Knew Too Much, you do have the angle of, I need to get this to the embassy, et cetera, et cetera. Politics are a big thing in it, but it doesn't quite play up the whole, corruption angle until you get to the Doris Day Man Who Knew Too Much.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, I don't know, like the fact that it's specifically highlighted with, like, quote, foreign officials. I don't know if that's also kind of ties into this whole equation we've been talking about. If that is in and of itself a statement, or if that just made it safe for him to critique authority because he was using figures that weren't.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And then another term that I wanted to talk about with the Man Who Knew Too Much, from the remake to the original, is in the original, like I said, I think this is because of Peter Lorre's casting, but I could be wrong. The original is a little girl. They have a daughter who gets kidnapped. But when you move on to the Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake, it's a little boy, and that difference is very intriguing to me, because I think it's an interesting play off of, it's an interesting play off of gender roles, because, in the original you have a man really, really trying really hard to save his daughter. But then when you have the remake, the angle of the remake, a lot of it's from Doris Day's perspective. So you have a mother trying to save her son. And what eventually saves her at the end, because I mean, in the original Man Who Knew Too Much, the dad gets kidnapped, and then, they're all hanging out, and then somehow the mom is at the concert at the end, and then blah blah, and the dad just kind of gets kidnapped with his daughter. But in the Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake, Doris Day and Jimmy Stewart are doing all they can to find their son, and because of a conversation with the you have
It's the connection through art.
You have Doris Day and her son being able to find each other because of things he learned from his mother. In addition to that, with these figures who kidnapped them, in the original it's just a bunch of men, but in the remake there's this woman figure as well. And, she's an older woman, and it eventually, she's kind of functions she functions as like, that, the kind of like femme fatale kind of character, which is interesting. She's an older woman, so it's Hitchcock playing off of that. But, she's the bad guy, but she eventually, because of, maternal instincts, because of whatever, et cetera, she allows the boy, to save himself through information his mother gave him, and she relates to Doris Day on a motherly level, and she ends up getting killed and punished for it. And just Hitchcock introducing so much of that angle into the remake is highly intriguing to me. Evelyn, thoughts?
Yeah. Also, thinking of that scene, because again, I haven't. I'm only familiar with the remake.
Mm-hmm.
Did they emphasize the stuff happening in a church in the original?
They did. There was it was kind of like. So the whole religious subtext, right? You have people hiding behind this religious, and you have people hiding behind religion for, immoral means in both films. Yeah. But, you really have a stronger subtext in the remake, just because the original, it makes sense why Hitchcock thinks it's failed, especially when you compare it to where it ends up in the remake. But in the original, they just kind of show up to the church, and then there's like a sermon, and then everybody fights, and then they leave.
Hashtag Kingsman.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the church sequence in the remake?
Yeah, it's been a little while, but I remember thinking that it was very interesting that Hitchcock, who really likes to dress his, really likes to be very detailed and meticulous with his sets, ended up setting this kind of final confrontation in what looks to be like, I would assume it's an Anglican church, because I know they're very particular about having the most like Spartan places of worship ever. And
he's also particular about the types of religion he critiques, I guess.
And again, it's been a little bit since I've seen this, so I'm a teeny bit foggy, but and also kind of that whole the whole tension in this, the kind of scene leading up to that confrontation where he's like walking in like mid-service, and there are all these kind of hapless people, and he's slowly kind of piecing together what's going on.
Well, in terms of the critique too, you have these people using this church for immoral means. Like, they've kidnapped a child,
Right.
and they're holding a child in this religious place. They're holding a child in this religious place. But at the same time, they're still holding a sermon, and they're still asking for donations, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of summed it up, but yeah, I guess that's something we might talk about in, or someone might talk about in the upcoming I Confess episode of
Which
Alfred
is the
August.
last episode of Alfred August in a few weeks.
But yeah, Hitchcock and religion is kind of interesting because he's like it's a term you hear a lot, but it almost seems he's one of those people who is very or spirituality is good, religion is bad kind of mentality, because he's institutions in general seem like something he critiques, which also made this film interesting because they're not perfect, but this is probably the most like functional married couple I recall seeing in a Hitchcock film.
So yeah, because with Hitchcock, he's usually critiquing the institution of marriage. So he's usually not very favorable to married couples. For whatever reason, they don't, and it's not really shown as something favorable. Marriages in Hitchcock films are usually shown to be toxic, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm actually also, that's a good point that you bring up. Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day are very healthy in the film.
Yeah, well, because they end up, for the most part, they end up working together. And like there is that point at the end where like he goes off and he's like, stay here, and then a little while later she goes off, and there's this whole like that's a pretty strong subtext of the film, is the need for cooperation between those two figures. And with Hitchcock being someone who's kind of focused on a lot of his films, you see kind of a like the dichotomy of parental figures and marriage figures. So it's interesting that this was the film he kind of almost not went back on that, but almost sort of, I guess, solved the puzzle that he was working on.
Yeah, and well, even if we're looking at Doris Day in particular, I think it's one of the healthiest relationships Doris Day is shown to be in film too, because Jimmy Stewart, he never really questions her authority.
Yeah, not really.
There are those moments, like you said, where he's like, no, you stay here, I gotta go do this thing. But then, she leaves to do her own thing eventually, and he never questions that, They work very well together, and I think the big scene, it's one of my favorite scenes in any Hitchcock film ever. But the Que Sera Sera scene, they communicate just so effectively.
Yeah.
And I think that's a high point, and that's a deliberate decision from Hitchcock to turn this whole idea of the Hitchcock blonde and the femme fatale and et cetera, on its head.
Yeah, definitely. And like we talked about, subverting with Doris Day specifically, subverting those expectations for a woman in a Hitchcock film specifically.
Yeah, 100%. So, those were all my thoughts. Do you have any thoughts, Evelyn?
Also, this was, at the time, this was the big Hitchcock Returns to England movie, because there's that whole ending stretch that's set, in London, and the taxidermy shop and all that good stuff.
I completely forgot about that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of that was, because we know like Hitchcock had he left England in the 40s and had never really come back, and had sort of focused his sight and his statements in his film on kind of on Hollywood, on America, on the United States. And then in this film, I guess because maybe it was because of kind of the global nature of the story, but this was the first time, and he wouldn't do a purely British film until Frenzy in the 70s.
Which, was that technically his last film?
I think the other one...
Family Plot?
Yeah, I think Family Plot was his last one.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then I think, too, this film was the end of his relationship with Bernard Herrmann.
Yeah, because that was like, was that because Torn Curtain was the one that like broke him?
Oh my
up?
God, no,
this the
yeah, it was
last
Torn
one?
Curtain. Just kidding.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Yeah, well, I do like because
No. You know what it is? Bernard Herrmann has a cameo in the film because he's
Yeah.
the conductor at the end.
Yeah,
So I
and-
got those mixed
Yeah,
up.
and they have that big play, like the whatever concert by Bernard Herrmann, and you're like, hey, I know that guy.
You're like, and again, it's him.
And again, getting that sort of salvation by art kind of thing with the climax happening in this big concert hall, with the big operatic scene kind of emphasizing everything.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the whole kind of corruption angle?
I guess there's kind of always an undercurrent talking about Hitchcock as questioning institutions. Law is another one because that's something you see. I'm thinking of like the 39 Steps is one where it stands out, where like he goes to the local police and is like, oh, this guy's a spy, and they're like, oh, sure, kid, and
okay.
and then they start hauling him in, and like
It's a thing of like it's not even always that law is corrupt. It's almost sometimes too that like laws that people are just ignorant, and there's this whole kind of like other subset, which is where like a lot of the spy genre is rooted from Hitchcock, and that's part of why. But
the law being just as human as anyone, and that's what makes it scary.
Or the law almost being a formality that nobody really has to follow, and the only reason like laws are a thing is because we feel like we should follow them. That's a thing that's critiqued in Hitchcock films. But
definitely.
Sounds good. So Evelyn, do you have any other final thoughts?
Yeah. Lodger is pretty good.
The Lodger. The Lodger is pretty good.
The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Wow. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, The Man Who Knew Too Much is a pretty good film. It's actually one of my favorite Hitchcocks, I will say. It's probably in my top 3 with Notorious.
It's definitely...
I'm obsessed with Doris Day.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the ones that's kind of a culmination of sort of his formula in a lot of ways. Because it fits that 39 Steps, Saboteur... North by Northwest pattern, but bringing the family into it gives it an extra dimension that kind of makes it stick out even among those Hitchcock films.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, so we will see you guys next time for another one in Alfred August. Thank you guys so much, and tell them where they can find you, Evelyn.
You can find me at Evie Override on YouTube, at Cineborg Productions, also on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook.
I will see you guys next day. I will see you guys next time on Alfred August. And